Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring Carl Jung and Karl Marx. My guest is James P. Driscoll, who was my roommate in 1969 when I was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin. Jim was just finishing up his doctoral degree in Renaissance literature at the time. He is the author of Identity in Shakespearean Drama, The Unfolding God of Jung and Milton, Shakespeare and Jung, The God in Time, Shakespeare's Identities, Jung's Cartography of the Psyche, How AIDS Activists Challenged America and Saved the FDA from Itself, The Devil and Dr. Fauci, The Many Faces of Bureaucratic Evil, Karl versus Karl, most recently, Jung and Marx, two icons for our age. Jim lives in Las Vegas, Nevada. Welcome, Jim. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Hello, Jeffrey. It's good to be back.
You've really done something that I think for you is breaking new ground to write a book about Karl Marx and Carl Jung. It's interesting that they both have almost the same first name. It's pronounced the same. The spelling is slightly different.
Yes, and these two Karls are, as I say in the book, they're really hugely important, iconic and archetypal figures in terms of representing archetypes that are active in our civilization now and really for the last century or so, and probably several decades on into the future. They're tremendously significant figures. Jung's significance is not as generally recognized, of course, as Karl's. I mean, Karl's significance just hits you in the face because his followers have taken over political systems that rule 1 to 2 billion people and have impact on the entire planet. But Jung is probably, in my view, he's the best representative of the whole archetypal complex that is a viable alternative to Marx in our time. And I think guiding us, Jung is crucial, really. Understanding Jung is crucial to guiding us out of the problems that we're stuck with a kind of cathexis on Marx and Marx ideas. And, if you listen to so-called conservative thinkers, in my view, they're neglecting Jung and they're not offering as strong an alternative as they could and should, in that they just want to go back to things that we've discarded for good reasons. They want to go back to the flood or reenact the strict rules of the caste system in India, something like this. And Jung really shows the way that we can move ahead. But one of the important things that I guess I learned from writing the book was to value Marx more than I did previously. And I see him as a destructive force, but also a vital positive force. And there's the Jungian idea of the coincidentia oppositorum, the joining of opposites, which creates a kind of synthesis. And I eventually reached the conclusion that rather than seeking for the exclusion of and repudiation of Marx, we need a synthesis that includes what is valuable in Marx. And so that's one of the important points that the book makes. The book deals a lot with religion, and the very last thing in the book, the epilogue, is just short. It's just a page, and I've titled it Jesus Christ Activist. And Jung, of course, makes a great deal of about Christ as a symbol of the self, as the individuation is symbolized by the crucifixion and Christ's life and so on. Christ as a symbol, as an archetype, is hugely important within Jung, and that differentiates him, of course, from Freud and most of the other mainline 20th century psychologists. But it's also the case that Marx derives importantly from the same critic, the same figure from Christ, in that Christ is the archetypal activist. He not only is the symbol of the self, but he is the archetypal activist. And Marx, while not himself, he's the archetypal activist thinker, I suppose, of our time. Not necessarily the best or the most important one in all history, but the most important, the most influential one that we have today. And so they really both derive from different aspects of this signally important figure that was Christ, or Jesus, whatever you want to call him. So in a way, if you create the coincidentia oppositorum of the quest for building and so on, in a way you might see it as an effort to reconnect with the whole of Jesus or Christ, and not just with parts of it, but to bring the whole thing together.
Okay, well, that was a very good introduction to your book. I think it would be very useful to begin with to give our viewers a sense of where you are approaching this exploration of the two Karls. First of all, I know that you would be considered possibly the foremost critic of Renaissance literature from a Jungian perspective. So you're probably more in the Jungian camp than in the Marxist camp.
Yes, I'm definitely more in the Jungian camp than in the Marxist camp, but I see Marx as a lot stems from what may have been really the first serious work that I did and published. It was originally in my dissertation and then published separately in a couple of different forms since then. And I started out working on the idea of God in King Lear, which is a signally important work because tragedy is the peculiar art form of the West and Western civilization. It's one of its distinctive features. Other civilizations do not have real tragedies. The course, they have sad and disastrous stories, but not tragedy. And this is, by the more sophisticated critics' opinion, the greatest of all the tragedies and the most tragic of them. And so I saw King Lear in terms of Jung's answer to Job, in which he discusses the development of Yahweh in the Old Testament and the conflicts in the book of Job, and how there's an attempt throughout history, through the prophets and on into Jesus and so on, to deal with and resolve these problems, which center on the whole question of evil, why it's there. Jung and Marx, they kind of represent, to an important degree, not entirely, but Jung talks about the two hostile brothers. I know, like Jordan Peterson loves to talk about the two hostile brothers, and this is a tremendously important Jungian archetype. Of course, it goes back to the Bible, Abel and Cain, and so on. But in a way, Jung and Marx are iconic exemplifications of the two hostile brothers. Marx being the Cain figure, Jung being the Abel figure. Now, that's just part of Jung. And Jung is really bigger than that, because Jung's goal is, he said, I don't want to be good or perfect. I want to be whole. And that's Jung's goal. It's individuated wholeness. Jung recognizes, of course, that's just a goal that we strive for. No one ever fully achieves it, but some people go much further in realizing it than the average people. And Jung, of course, was one of those people who went, I think, very far down the path toward realizing it. I also think over in the arts, Shakespeare was someone who went very far down that path, perhaps further down the path than any other great writer or artist. The importance of seeing Jung and Marx in terms of each other is a key to understanding, I think, not just the dynamics of our time, but also the nature of the Godhead in our time. And I think of the Godhead as, I sort of coined the term, collective autonomous complex. And Jung talks about autonomous complexes. It's an important idea to him. He sees how they can be, take over, well, for example, his writings about the Nazis are really about how the Wotan autonomous complexes from Germany's dark past, identified with mythical figures, took over thinking and group behavior in Germany at that time. And to my knowledge, he doesn't use the word collective autonomous complexes, and collective, that's kind of a word borrowed from Marx. But I like the term, and I think of gods as collective autonomous complexes. Now, I'm not saying in that means that there's no God of the universe, that's just what gods are. But as we know them, as they shape civilization, I think that's primarily, psychologically speaking, what the gods are. And I remember when I visited the island of Delos, we had a guide, and she emphasized there's this little barren nothing of an island off of Mykonos in the Greek Isles. But at the time of the ancient world. It was tremendously important because it was thought, and tens of thousands of people lived there, even though there's no water. It was thought to be the birthplace of Apollo. And I was struck by how important Apollo was then, that it was like a real entity to the people in the Hellenic world, just like Jesus or Satan might be, or Allah might be real entities today. And that sort of shaped my idea of the collective autonomous complex. But collective autonomous complexes unfold. And one of the ways, I think, Jung was very interested in how this was going to unfold. Even though he didn't use the term, he was interested in how the Christian and idea, or the Judeo-Christian idea of God, is unfolding in the world and in the West, and where it is going. He saw us now as in a very dark place, and he thought that the way out of this dark place is to get reconnected with the soul and the deeper elements of the psyche, with the self, really, to realize the self. But there's just this view that things are very dark now, and a question I've had is, where is the collective autonomous complex that is behind Judeo-Christianity, that he saw as a quaternary, you saw as a quaternary, and so on? Well, where is that going? And it seems to me that to understand where it's going and to understand the complex itself, we not only need Jung, we need to bring in what Marx represented in a constructive way, into a kind of synthesis. And a key to what was important to Jung is, you might say, consciousness. To put one term on Marx, what I think he thought that he was seeking was justice. That's the problem of justice, is not something that Jung and the Jungians want to deal with very directly. They do deal with the problem of evil, of course, and that's justice is an aspect of that. But I think you can't deal with the problem of evil in the biggest sense without considering the issue of justice. And Marx was kind of a monomaniacal. He wanted, or at least he thought he wanted justice, that he was seeking justice, that what was most important to him was not a good society, but a society that would be more just than what he had. Now, his critics say, with a lot of validity, that what he was really seeking was power. And of course, you can't achieve justice or a lot of other important things in life without power.
I want to let our viewers know, Jim, that we've done many interviews on this topic in the past. In particular, we did an interview on the Godhead archetype, and I'm going to link to it here in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If viewers want to see that interview, I'll link to several of the previous interviews with you. it'll give our viewers a little more of a context if they haven't watched them before. Of course, if you're watching this on an iPhone, I'm not sure about a tablet, sometimes these links to other videos embedded in the YouTube video don't show up. But for those of you watching on a computer, they certainly will show up. And I would highly encourage readers or viewers who are with us this far to look into the previous interviews that we've done together.
Yes, I think that would be worthwhile. But I think I should try to get a bit back more towards Marx.
Let me interrupt again because I want to give some viewers a bit of biographical history so they understand you. There was a time in your life as a result of social circumstances where you felt depressed and you sought therapy. You sought Jungian therapy and you learned a great deal about Jung in that context, but you felt the therapy was ineffective because your basic issue was more of a sociological issue than a psychological one.
Yes, that's correct. I did feel that I felt that the understanding how my psyche worked and problems that were largely psychological was very useful, but that I had a justice problem too, which the Jungians didn't dealt with, and as a result of this, I think guided by the self. I like to think that I'm guided by the self. And it's always a big issue with people, whether they know it or not. Are they being guided? Are they being guided by the self or the ego? Or they can also be guided by their shadow. Hitler was entirely a figure of the shadow, ruled by the satanic part of his psyche almost entirely. And then there's the anima or the animus. They can also rule you too. And there's the persona. Those are the primary figures. But if you're going to go towards individuation, the key is to get in touch with the self and let the self guide you. And so I like to think that I was being guided by the self, and sometimes the self will push you into ways you wonder why you are here and why you made this mistake, and it turns out not to be a mistake, that the self is pushing you down the path that it wants to go, and it leads you actually to something more positive than what the ego was seeking. But you have to, it's very hard to learn to listen to the self. It's much easier to listen to the shadow, the persona, or the anima than it is to the self. And that's Jungian training is very useful for that. But so I became involved as an AIDS and gay activist, principally an AIDS activist during the AIDS epidemic. And I wrote my book on how AIDS activists challenged America, which is the story of my work, which I think of as important. And in fact, there was something that I think Bill Gates, one of his foundation sponsors, and put out a list with, I think they called it Book Authority. They put out a list of the 20 greatest AIDS books of all time. And I was surprised to see they had rated my book number 3. And it's the story of the struggle of San Francisco activists with the FDA to get the drugs approved and out into people to save lives. And that was how I worked on the justice thing. And the insight I had much earlier, and it came from the Jungian work, was I came to realize that evil is a challenge to create new good. And that's how you have to deal with evil. You have to find the opportunity within it to create some good that wasn't there before. Now, this can be very difficult, and sometimes it can be impossible. You can just be defeated. You'll die. Whatever. But that's the challenge of evil, is to create new good. And that differentiates it from the view of evil where the challenge is purity, that I can't be soiled by this. And this is, again, a Jungian point of view. He was willing to be soiled by the material and so on if it would further his quest for wholeness. It's necessary to do that. If you don't do that, you'll be just stuck in following rules and thinking you're okay if you just conform to this rule book. You got your 10 Commandments or whatever it is, and you just follow that, and that's all that's all you need to do to be, shall we say, in the grace of God. No, that's not true. You need to creatively work to transform the evils that you encounter in life into something that's good for you or somebody else.
Well, I think both Jung and Marx might agree on that particular point, but it does seem to me that one of the important contrasts between Jung and Marx that you draw very clearly in your book is that Jung almost completely neglects the question of social justice, and Marx almost completely neglects the idea of individual wholeness and individual growth.
Unfortunately, that's very accurate, Jeffrey. The criticisms are spot on in both cases. And so that's why it's valuable to look at both of them, and that's why I'm trying to do that in the book. In the book, I deal with important questions that they both have interesting insights on. For example, money and material resources. They look at them quite differently, but it's everybody knows that this is a subject that Marx focuses on. But Jung has very interesting things to say about money, too, that our way of dealing with money is really a way of dealing with the soul. They have opposing views, which in some ways are complementary, though, on the questions of science. Marx was basically a positivist and skeptical and not interested in the spiritual or the parapsychological. Jung was quite interested in the parapsychological and was certainly unwilling to just deny it to be in line with the consensus attitude that you often find among the sciences.
Well, Jung, as I understand it, would have pictured reality as being primarily driven by subconscious forces, archetypal forces, as he described them. And Marx seemed to suggest that reality was driven by a dialectical process based, I think, on the Hegelian dialectic.
Yeah, historical determinism, that's true of Marx. And also that the basis for understanding everything is the material forces at play. And the economic forces, of course. And Jung saw the economy as a way of projecting soul. But that's not dismissing it. He's far from being I guess the term would be an aesthetic. Like, you remember that back in the early centuries of Christianity, you had these people that went out in the desert and denied themselves everything and tried to be as dissociated as possible from material needs, wants, and so on. That's not Jung at all.
No, Jung lived a life of luxury. He seemed to identify more with the middle and the upper classes, who were his patients and his colleagues, whereas Marx seemed to be a champion of the working class, those who were alienated and disaffected with the larger, what you might call the elite of society.
The oppressed, the people who got the short end of the stick. Marx was interesting in that respect, though, because he was, Marx was kind of, in some ways, a normal human being, in that he had normal ambitions. He had several children. He probably wasn't a very good father. He had to struggle with economic issues all of his life. And Jung, after he married Emma, who was heir to the largest watch company in Switzerland, had no economic problems whatsoever. And he adjusted very thoroughly to that. So he was comfortable with patients who were from the Mellon and the Rockefeller families and things like this, whereas Marx was always trying to make ends meet, and at the same time, it was very important to Marx to maintain a middle-class lifestyle. He wasn't a bohemian like the typical Marxist college students living with bricks and boards bookcases and a poster of Che Guevara on the wall. That's not Marx. He aspired to maintain the middle-class life that he grew up in. And interestingly enough, Marx grew up in a wealthy Jewish family. And I believe it was either his father or his grandfather converted from Judaism to Lutheranism because that was useful for pursuing a legal career. So he wanted to always hold on to that and fussed about marriages and the money involved in them. Whereas Jung grew up in, it was a kind of rural near poverty, I would say. He was, his father was a pastor of a village church. So he was much poorer. And yet it didn't seem to impact him that much. I don't think it caused him any suffering. And it might have allowed him, growing up in that village or rural circumstances, it allowed him to become more closer to nature than Marx ever was. Marx always was an urban person and spent the last portion of his life in the British Library, living in London. That's another interesting thing. Jung traveled quite a lot for that time, and it wasn't so easy to travel then. They didn't have jet planes, but he was to Africa, to India, to New Mexico, where you live. He was there. And he was quite interested in all of seeing firsthand all the different cultures that were out there, whereas Marx remained with his books in the British Library.
Well, both of them espoused allegiance to the scientific method. Both of them wanted to be considered primarily as scientific figures.
But Marx was much more over in the positivistic area, although I was interested in that when reading the stuff. And I found that he was not especially intolerant. That's a problem. Some of these people over in the positive can be very intolerant, and they just want to shoot down parapsychological facts and dismiss them and so on. You, of course, wanted to study. Marx was essentially positive, but he wasn't intolerant and dogmatic. And of course, as you said, he was Hegelian in important ways. So he thought that there were these overriding patterns, and he wasn't really an atheist. He's dismissed as an atheist, but it was more like, rather than saying that God didn't exist, he thought that a personal God didn't exist, and that God wasn't especially important. But I think that he probably realized that his own historical determinism was a kind of God, was a version of God. And so it's not like he felt or thought that it's just randomness or chaos out there with no meaning. I think the problem with this philosophy was that his idea of meaning was overly focused on the question of justice, and it was very narrow, whereas Jung's idea of meaning was hugely expansive.
Well, both Marx and Jung, I think, it would be fair to say, rebelled against conventional religion. But their rebellion took them, I think, in somewhat different directions.
Marx took really a great deal from, there's Raymond Aron in his book out of the 1950s where he draws out the parallels between it's really Catholicism and Marx, and how all sorts of ideas, that the organization of the party in certain important respects follows that of the church, and dogma in the party has parallels to the church, and what he calls messianism, the idea of the Messiah. He shows how all sorts of key things in Marx have their roots in the church. Now, the causation is probably more historical than Marx was not an admirer of the church. He thought that the church was an instrument used for by the nobility in the feudal times for the oppression of the working class. But nonetheless, the ideas of doctrine and organization and so on were kind of transmogrified from the church into what became the party.
In other words, Marxism served for many people as a substitute for religion, and I think people have accused Jung of doing something similar, of trying to substitute depth psychology for religion.
I think that both statements are accurate, although I don't necessarily think that it's a criticism of Jung, an effective criticism. If it were an effective criticism, it would mean that you need to go back to and become more deeply committed to a religion. I think Jung would have said that whatever your cultural background, you're Jewish, you're Buddhist, you're Muslim, you're Christian, you need to try to understand that. And that is going to be where your repertoire of myth and symbols comes from. So you need to deal with it. And just dismissing it and saying, oh, Christianity and Judaism are worthless, I'm going to be a Hindu. He saw that as something that results in a kind of psychological dysfunction. And his friend, the translator of the I Ching, Richard Wilbur, I believe.
Richard Wilhelm.
Oh, yeah, Richard Wilhelm. He saw that as an example of someone that had befallen, who had that problem, and had kind of a split personality come out of that. It wasn't like this was a severe criticism, but I think that one of the things about Jung, which I would remark, is that I thought that he himself, to an extent, was guilty of the same thing, in that he downplayed perhaps too much the motivation coming out of problems he had with his own father and with the Swiss church and so on when he was, a child. Of course, he was heavily exposed to this, being the son of a pastor. He was, marched off to church on a regular basis. And I think that he had kind of an emotional reaction to Protestantism that caused him to be overly favorable and hopeful about Catholicism, and not to understand as well as he should have the criticisms and the point of view of Protestantism and what was unique to Protestantism, what was valuable in Protestantism. I don't think he understood it as well as he should because of this rejection. And I think he also had a bit of an animus against Judaism as a result of, he had two fathers, Sigmund Freud and his own natural father. And he had reactions against both of them. And they were very emotional, really. I mean, you know how he went through several years of almost a psychotic breakdown after the breakup with Freud, where he wrote the Red Book and had various strange is in communication with spirits, and went through a very traumatic time, which, interestingly enough, of course, paralleled the world, in that the world was immersed in World War I, and he was in Switzerland, but he's sitting in the very center of it, and it was like the world was collapsing around him, and he's extremely sensitive to that. I found that interesting too, how extremely sensitive he was, almost like at levels, at so many different levels, not just the intellectual level. Intellectually, we may be disturbed about something we hear that's going on somewhere, the war in Ukraine or something, but we don't have a kind of total involvement. He had a kind of total involvement in what was going on in Western civilization at that time. And he was also, Jung was just exceptionally sensitive to Western civilization. And even though he didn't specifically identify it, I think, he was exceptionally sensitive to the collective autonomous complex that I see as associated with the Judeo-Christian Godhead and sort of acting as a personality evolving and developing and guiding the West along its path for 2,500 years. He's very sensitive, exceptionally sensitive to that.
Well, it does strike me that Jung's appreciation of these archetypal realities isn't so different from Marx's appreciation of the Hegelian dialectic, which, even though it's couched in the language of materialistic determinism based on social and economic forces, Hegel, if I understand him, and I'm certainly not a student of the history of philosophy, but his idea of a dialectic seems very idealistic to me.
Yeah, I think it's idealistic in the sense that it entails progress. That's what the dialectic creates, is progress. It solves problems, too. Mm-hmm. You've got an initial problem. It breaks up into the opposition, and then you get a synthesis. And then you keep moving on. You keep moving up towards a kind of creation at the end. Although Marx didn't exactly go there, but you create an ideal state at the end. You move towards constant improvement of things, and but the problem was the classless society never happens when Marxists take over, and he wasn't in a position to deal with that problem because. While Marx is one of the most famous thinkers in the world today, he wasn't then. He wasn't particularly important during his lifetime.
And he died in the 1880s, as I recall.
Right, and his ideas began to take hold in Germany and in Russia afterwards.
Well, there are proponents of Marxism who say we haven't yet achieved a Marxist society. The experiments in Russia and in China and North Korea and elsewhere never really embodied Marxism as Marx intended.
I guess you could ask why not? Why did they fail? Not just say, well, we're going to try again. For one thing, it's stupid to try again without figuring out why you failed the previous time. What went wrong? What's the pattern? How do you avoid things that go wrong? Well, one of the things that went wrong, famous thing, is the cult of personality. One person, Stalin, Chavez, whatever, takes over everything and forms the society along the lines of his biases and predilections. They don't. I don't see them as dealing with that in a constructive way, because I guess I look at it primarily as the critics do, that it's a quest for power. Now, it depends on what you're talking about, what age group you're talking about. If you're talking about young people who think the world should be better and want to do something to make the world better, that's different from talking about people who are already engaged in a political course. And the engagement of it's like famous saying, Lord Acton, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. Well, there's this very strong tendency for anyone who becomes engaged in the political sphere to be corrupted by it. And one of the criticisms that I would have of Christianity, particularly Catholicism, but really of all, not just Christianity, probably all organized religions, although not an expert on the history of the others, is that the way that politics seeps in and corrupts things. Like, for example, when Constantine became a Christian, the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, he didn't just become a nominal Christian or just start going to Mass and nothing else. He shaped and changed all sorts of things about Christianity in accordance with his own predilections. And very few people understand that. For example, the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. One of the reasons that's not in the Bible, it's not in the Jewish tradition, it's not something that Jesus or Paul taught. It wasn't even something that Christians discussed during the first 2 centuries in any of their significant writings. But it was gaining force in the 3rd century, and Constantine was very much committed to that. And there's a whole group of things that Constantine did, and of course, as it follows throughout the rest of the history of Christianity, the Reformation, for example, Henry VIII, determining the character of the Anglican Church. Politics, I think politics always has a bad influence on religion. It always corrupts religion. And that's Raymond Aron's book delineates how that happens. One of the key things about Marxism is that it's very well set up to serve bureaucracies. And Jungianism, it does not serve bureaucracies well at all.
I would agree with you, but there is a sense in which a cult of personality exists in the Jungian world.
Yes, that's true. And it goes on. Well, a cult of personality exists in the Freudian world too, though. And it's in the world of Platonism. There's every great thinker and leader tends to have cult-like followers, and it's a problem. You have to be wary of it. It has to be dealt with, and if you're going to be a Jungian, you have to avoid the pitfall of thinking everything that Jung says must be good and right, and Jung can't be wrong on anything. That's a big mistake. But cult followers tend to assume that. Or if they will at least not want to deal with it, they'll want to avoid these areas where, like justice, for example, where Jung doesn't do much. Where he's inadequate. You can't follow just one thinker if you're wanting to move along the path of wholeness, for intellectual wholeness, spiritual wholeness, and so on. You don't get it all from just one thinker. Everyone has limitations because no one, and you would have said this too, no one achieves wholeness. They just strive for it, or we just strive for it. That's all.
Well, James Driscoll, this has been an enlightening conversation. I know we're just scratching the surface of these 2 iconic figures, Marx and Jung. Thank you so much for being with me today.
I enjoyed it, Jeffrey, and it's always a pleasure.
And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.